sky over the Ashfields was the color of a bruised lung, a heavy, swirling expanse of charcoal and ochre that never let the sun through. It had been 5 centuries since the burn, and the earth still tasted of copper and old death. Ambrosia Jones adjusted the seal on her rebreather, the mechanical hiss of her own breath, rhythmic and cold. Beneath her heavy tactical boots, the ground didn't crunch. It yielded like pulverized bone. This was the dead zone, a stretch of the eastern seaboard where the radiation levels were high enough to liquefy a civilian's organs in 48 hours. But Ambrosia wasn't a civilian. She was a hunter, and her gear was the pinnacle of post-collapse engineering. Her gauntlet-mounted scanner gave a sharp, high-pitched chirp. The holographic display flickered to life, casting a ghostly blue glow against her matte black armor. "Class-A Fae presence," she whispered, her voice rasping against the internal mic. "High-density energy signature, moving toward the spire." 6 years. She had spent 6 years in the dirt, tracking the things that had broken the world. Every kill, every bounty, every trophy she brought back to the hunter's citadel was a brick in the wall she was building around her soul. She was the best, the youngest to ever make Vanguard. The legends in the barracks said she could smell a glow skin from a mile away. "Dex, you seeing this?" she asked, flicking a glance toward the jagged silhouette of a collapsed skyscraper 100 yards to her left. "I see it, Brosia." Dex's voice crackled through the comms, Finnick with his usual unearned bravado. "Hotter than a reactor core. If that's a high Fae, the payout from the ministry could buy us our own sector in the inner city. Imagine that. Real steak, real air, and no more slag shoveling." Ambrosia's lip curled. Dex was a good shot, but he was a parasite. He looked at the world through the lens of a ledger. She looked at it through the sights of a rifle. To her, the Fae weren't just targets. They were the architects of this gray misery. The propaganda posters, peeling and scorched, still clung to the rusted remains of a bus stop they passed. A beautiful, ethereal woman with pointed ears and iridescent eyes was depicted behind a curtain of fire. Glowskin started the burn. The blocky letters screamed, "They took our son. We take their lives." It was the first thing every child learned in the creche. The Fae had come as refugees, beggars from another realm, and when they realized humanity wouldn't hand over the keys to the kingdom, they had sparked the nuclear winter. They had watched from their hidden groves, untouched by the radiation, while the human race withered. "Move up," Ambrosia commanded. "Take the west flank of the cathedral ruins. I'll flush them toward you. You're the bait, Dex. Don't miss." "Bait. Again?" Dex grumbled, but he complied. He knew better than to argue with her when she had that particular edge in her voice. Ambrosia watched his heat signature move into position before she ghosted forward. She didn't move like a human. Even she knew that. There was a fluid, terrifying grace to her stride that made the heavy ceramic plating of her armor feel like a second skin. She felt the vibrations of the earth through the soles of her feet. She heard the whisper of the wind through the rebar like it was a conversation. The cathedral loomed ahead, a skeleton of stone and twisted iron, reaching for the suffocating sky. It had been a place of worship once, before God had been replaced by the Ministry of Survival. Now it was just a hive of shadows. Ambrosia stepped through the shattered arched entrance. The air inside was different, colder, yet strangely vibrant. The dust didn't settle here. It swirled in deliberate patterns, defying the laws of physics. Her scanner went wild, the blue light turning a frantic, bleeding red. Target in vicinity. She lowered her rifle, the magnetic rail slug humming as it charged. Her heart didn't race. It never did. Instead, a profound stillness settled over her. Every sense sharpened to a razor's edge. She could hear the click of an insect's legs, a floor above her. She could smell the faint, impossible scent of crushed jasmine beneath the heavy stench of ozone. He was waiting for her. Standing where the altar used to be was a figure, draped in heavy, tattered robes of midnight blue. A hood was pulled low, and a mask of polished obsidian covered his face, reflecting Ambrosia's own armored form back at her. He didn't look like he was hiding. He looked like a king awaiting an audience. "Dex, I've got eyes on," Ambrosia said quietly. "Don't move until I engage." The figure didn't flinch. Through the obsidian mask, she felt a gaze that was heavy, ancient, and impossibly focused. "You've been following me since the border of the Ashfields, Hunter." A voice rang out. It wasn't the screeching alien sound she'd been told Fae made. It was deep, resonant, and moved through her chest like a cello bow. "You're a Class-A fugitive," Ambrosia replied, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Surrender, and the ministry might keep your head in a jar instead of on a pike." The figure moved then, a blur of shadow and motion. Ambrosia fired. The rail slug tore through the air, traveling at 3 times the speed of sound, but the figure wasn't there. He was a streak of darkness along the peripheral of her vision. She dropped the rifle. It was too slow for this range, and drew the twin vibroblades from her thighs. The blades hummed at a frequency designed to disrupt Fae glamour and flesh alike. They met in the center of the nave. The sound of metal clashing against whatever he used, a staff of black wood that shrieked like iron, echoed through the ruins. Ambrosia was a whirlwind. She didn't think. She reacted. She was faster than any hunter she had ever trained with. She dodged a strike that would have decapitated a normal man, her body contorting with a flexibility that defied her heavy gear. She pivoted, her blade whistling toward his throat, a kill shot that had ended a dozen high Fae before. But he parried it with a flick of his wrist. "He's playing with me," the thought flashed through her mind, sharp and stinging. Anger, hot and volatile, surged through her. Her vision tunneled. The red light of the scanner seemed to bleed into her actual sight. She felt a surge of strength, a frantic, pulsing energy in her veins that felt like fire. She launched herself at him, a flurry of strikes so fast they were invisible to the naked eye. She managed to catch the edge of his robe, slicing through the fabric. She saw a flash of skin, golden, unblemished, and radiating a faint, internal light. The hunter's rage peaked. She threw a punch, her gauntlet-enhanced fist aimed at the obsidian mask. It connected with the force of a battering ram. The mask shattered. The figure staggered back, and for the first time Ambrosia saw him. His hair was the color of a winter storm, long and wild, falling around a face of devastating, masculine beauty. His eyes were the most terrifying part, swirling pools of mercury and gold. He looked at her, and the air in the cathedral seemed to vanish. "Ambrosia," he whispered. She didn't know how he knew her name, and she didn't care. She lunged again, her vibro blade aimed at his heart. But he was done being defensive. He moved with a speed that exceeded her own, his hand lashing out like a viper. He caught her wrist, the strength in his fingers like a crushing vice. He twisted, sending her blade clattering to the stone floor, and in the same motion, he slammed her back against a crumbling pillar. His other hand came up, his palm slamming into her throat, pinning her. Ambrosia gasped, her lungs seizing. She struggled, her boots kicking against the stone, her free hand clawing at his arm. She looked up at him, expecting to see the cold, murderous intent of a monster. She expected the killing blow. But then, it happened. His hand was on the bare skin of her neck, just above the seal of her suit, where the armor had been buckled during the fight. Skin on skin. A physical shock, like a lightning strike, traveled through Ambrosia's entire body. It wasn't pain. It was something far more invasive. It was as if a wall in her mind, one she hadn't known existed, suddenly crumbled into dust. Her blood, usually a steady, icy rhythm, began to boil. It felt like a circuit had been completed. The king, Caspian, went completely still. His pupils dilated until his eyes were solid pits of gold. Ambrosia felt a pull. It was a terrifying magnetic force that dragged at the very center of her being. It was a recognition. It was as if her soul had been wandering in the gray dark for 24 years and had suddenly walked into a room full of candles. Mine. The word didn't come from her mind. It came from her marrow. It was an ancient, primal roar that drowned out the ministry's slogans, the hunter's training, and her own common sense. She looked at him, her breath hitching, her body betrayed by its own sudden frantic longing. He wasn't a monster. He was everything. Caspian's hand trembled against her throat. The pressure vanished, turning into something else, a caress. His thumb brushed over the line of her jaw, a touch so light it was almost a dream. yet it felt like it was branding her. His lips parted, a look of profound, agonizing shock on his face. He knew. He understood exactly what this was, even as she struggled in the suffocating grip of the unknown. "Mate," he breathed. The word was a vow and a curse. Outside, the sound of Dex's heavy footsteps echoed as he moved toward the entrance, his rifle clanking against his suit. "Ambrosia? Status. I heard the mask break. You got him?" The spell broke. Caspian's eyes cleared, the mercury returning to his gaze. He looked at the entrance, then back at her. For a heartbeat, she thought he would take her with him. For a heartbeat, she wanted him to. Instead, he let go. He stepped back into the shadows behind the altar, his form beginning to shimmer and dissolve into the gray dust of the ruins. "Run, Ambrosia Jones," he said, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "Run while you still believe you are human." He was gone. Ambrosia slumped against the pillar, her legs shaking so violently she had to slide down to the floor. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She touched her neck, the skin where he had held her feeling hot, as if it were glowing. Dex came around the corner, his rifle raised, his eyes scanning the empty space. "Where is he? Your scanner says Class-A, but there's nothing but dust here." He looked down at her, his brow furrowing as he saw her sitting on the ground, her blades discarded. "Ambrosia, you okay? Did he hit you?" Ambrosia looked up at Dex. She saw the ministry emblem on his shoulder. She saw the cold, greedy light in his eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt a wave of revulsion so strong it nearly made her sick. She thought of the gold eyes. She thought of the way her blood had sung at his touch. "Nothing," she said, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. She reached up and clicked her comms, her fingers steadying through sheer force of will. "Citadel. This is Vanguard Jones." Energy signature was a ghost, likely a lingering radiation pocket reacting with the stone. Negative contact. The silence on the other end was brief. "Copy that, Jones. Return to base for debrief." Dex scoffed, lowering his weapon. "A ghost? All this way for a pocket of gas? What a waste of a day." Ambrosia didn't answer. She stood up, picking up her blades and sheathing them. She didn't look back at the altar. She didn't look for the winter storm hair or the mercury eyes. She walked out of the cathedral and into the gray, dying world, carrying the first lie she had ever told. And deep in the Ashfields, she knew the hunter had just become the hunted. Chapter 2. The waystation at Edgetown was a scab on the skin of the wasteland, a cluster of reinforced shipping containers and scrap metal hovels huddled against the concrete remains of an old highway interchange. Here, the air was marginally less lethal, though it still tasted of charcoal and the chemical tang of the scrubbers. Ambrosia sat in the back of the filter, a bar that lived up to its name by serving liquid that looked like motor oil and tasted like regret. She had been staring at the same glass for 20 minutes, her gloved fingers tracing the rim. Across from her, Dex was busy boasting to a group of local scavengers about the ghost signature they had chased. He was embellishing, of course, making the cathedral sound like a fortress, and himself like the one who had cleared the perimeter. Ambrosia tuned him out. Her mind was a repetitive loop of golden eyes, and the sensation of her own blood turning into liquid fire. Negative contact. The lie sat in her gut like a stone. She did not understand why she had lied. She reached up, her fingers ghosting over the skin of her neck. The heat was gone, but the memory of it was a brand. She was a Vanguard hunter. She was the weapon the ministry wielded against the dark, and yet she had let a high Fae king walk away because her body had decided, for one heartbeat, that he was the center of the universe. The door to the bar creaked open, admitting a swirl of gray grit and a sudden sharp shift in the atmospheric pressure. Ambrosia did not look up, but her hand dropped instinctively to the combat knife at her thigh. Every instinct she possessed, instincts that had kept her alive for 6 years, screamed at once. Fae. It was not a warning of danger. Not exactly. It was a resonance, a hum in her marrow that matched the rhythm of the footsteps crossing the floor. He sat down 2 stools away. In the dim, flickering light of the bar, he looked different. The regal robes were gone, replaced by a weathered duster of reinforced canvas and heavy, grease-stained trousers. A glamour hung over him like a thin veil. It dulled the unnatural glow of his skin and masked the sharp, aristocratic points of his ears, making him look like just another drifter trying to survive the Ashfields. He looked human, and she knew he was not, but everyone else remained oblivious. But he had not hidden the hair. A thick, unruly mane of winter storm silver tumbled over his shoulders, tied back loosely with a strip of leather. Ambrosia felt the pull immediately. It was a physical weight, a gravity that tried to tilt her off her stool and toward him. She tightened her grip on her glass until the recycled plastic creaked. "That is a bold look for a dead zone," she said, her voice a low, dangerous rasp that cut through Dex's loud laughter. The stranger turned. His eyes were no longer swirling mercury. They were a deep, stormy gray. A clever trick of the light, she told herself. But the intensity remained. It was him, the king. "Vanity is the only thing the radiation could not kill," he replied. His voice was lower than in the cathedral, roughened by the dust, but it still sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the fear. "A pre-burn aesthetic revival. I like to think it reminds people that the world used to have color, even if it was just in a bottle of dye." "It is a target," Ambrosia countered, her eyes narrowing. "In the Ashfields, anything that is not gray or brown is a target." "I have always been a difficult target to hit," he signaled the bartender for a drink, his movements precise and economical. "I heard you were looking for signatures, real ones, not the ghosts the ministry keeps chasing." Dex chimed in, leaning over with a sneer. "And who the hell are you, Silvertop? Some scavenger with a death wish?" The stranger did not even look at Dex. His focus remained entirely on Ambrosia, a focus so singular it felt like an embrace. "My name is Casp, and I know the Ashfields better than your ministry maps. I know where the pockets are that the radiation will not touch. I know where the Fae hide because I have spent my life watching them." Ambrosia's heart skipped a beat. Casp, a nickname, a humanization. Did he think she was a fool? "Why tell us?" "Because you are the best hunter in the sector," he said, and for a second the gray eyes flared with a hidden gold. "And I have a vested interest in seeing certain things found. I need a way into the deeper zones. You have the gear and the clearance. I have the locations." Dex laughed, but Ambrosia did not join him. She felt the internal tug, the bond, though she had no name for it yet, insisting that this man was the answer to a question she had not dared to ask. It was a provocation. He was standing in the open, daring her to see through the mask, daring her to see her next move. "I do not work with civilians," Ambrosia said. "Then work with a consultant," Casp replied, "one who can take you to the High King's trail." Ambrosia looked at Dex. He was a liability. She wanted to know why she felt such a dangerous pull to this stranger, her curiosity about him going against everything she had been taught since she was a child. Dex could not come. He was loud, sloppy, and his loyalty was to the paycheck, not the mission. If she was going to find the truth about what happened in that cathedral, and why her body was currently screaming at her to touch the man with the silver hair, she could not have Dex watching her back. "Dex," she said, not looking away from Casp, "go back to the Citadel. Tell them I am pursuing a lead solo, that the ghost left a trail only a specialist can follow." "What? You are ditching me for this clown?" Dex stood up, face reddening. "That is an order, Vanguard Jr., Ambrosia snapped, her eyes flashing with a cold light that made Dex stumble back. "Resupply and head out. Now." Dex muttered a curse, grabbed his gear, and stomped out of the bar. Ambrosia waited until the door settled before she turned fully to the stranger. "If you are lying to me, Casp, I will not just kill you. I will make sure the ministry uses you for target practice." Caspian inclined his head, a ghost of a smile playing on his perfect lips. "I would not expect anything less, Hunter." "Caspian." The weight of the lie was a physical pressure in his chest, more stifling than the human air he was forced to breathe. He watched her from the corner of his eye as they prepared to leave Edgetown. Ambrosia Jones. She was a vision of lethal efficiency, checking the seals on her armor and the charge in her rail rifle with a mechanical detachment. She did not know. She did not know that the strength she took pride in was a gift from his bloodline. She did not know that she was the daughter of a stolen fae, a product of a cruelty he had only recently begun to map the true extent of. But above all, she did not know she was his. The fated mate bond was a living thing between them, a golden cord that thrummed every time she moved within 10 feet of him. It was a constant, aching demand to reach out, to pull her against him, to scent the skin of her neck and claim the space she occupied. Instead, he forced himself to stand still. He forced himself to play the part of the helpful drifter. I am doing this to save my people, he reminded himself. She is the key to finding the breeding sectors. She is the only one with the clearance to get us through the ministry's inner perimeter. But as he watched her tighten a strap on her thigh, her jaw set in a hard, beautiful line, the truth felt far more selfish. He was doing this because he could not let her go, because the thought of her returning to that cold, steel citadel, to the people who had lied to her and used her as a weapon against her own kind, made his magic claw at his throat. We moved toward the black spires, Ambrosia said, her voice snapping him back to the present. My scanner picked up a faint resonance there after we left the cathedral. If you are as good as you say, you will find the path that does not trigger the ministry's seismic sensors. The spires are dangerous for humans, Caspian said carefully. The radiation there is not just in the air, it is in the stone. It plays tricks on the mind. I have been in the spires before, she dismissed him, swinging her pack onto her shoulders. Not with me, he murmured, a hint of his true authority slipping through the glamour. She paused, her hand on the doorframe of the waystation. She looked at him, and for a moment the suspicion in her eyes wavered, replaced by that raw, confused hunger he had seen in the cathedral. Do not get used to the proximity, Casp, she warned, though her voice lacked its usual bite. I am still a hunter, and you are still a resource. Of course, he said, his heart heavy with the irony. The first 3 days of travel were a study in silence and tension. The Ashfields gave way to the spires, jagged needles of obsidian and basalt that pierced the low-hanging smog. They moved through a landscape of twisted metal and scorched rock, the only sound the crunch of their boots and the distant, mournful howl of the wind. Ambrosia was a shadow. She moved with a silence that Caspian knew was instinctual, a trait passed down through generations of Fae warriors, now honed for the purpose of killing them. She kept a constant distance of 5 paces between them. If he moved closer, her hand moved to her weapon. And yet, he caught her watching him. At night, when they huddled in the lee of a collapsed bridge or a rocky overhang, she would sit with her back to the stone, her eyes tracking the way he moved. She watched the way he built a fire, without a lighter, though she did not seem to notice the lack of flint, and the way he navigated the stars through the thick haze. The bond did not care about her professional distance. It simmered in the small space between them, a localized heat that made the freezing nights bearable. Caspian could feel her hyper-awareness of him. He knew when her breath hitched, when her heart rate spiked, when she shifted her weight to be closer to his warmth. It was a provocation he had to resist. Every time he wanted to offer her a piece of dried protein or a drink from his canteen, he had to calculate the risk. If he showed too much care, she would suspect. If he showed too little, he would starve the bond until it became a physical ache. On the 4th night, they found shelter in the hollowed-out shell of an old research station. The walls were thick enough to block the wind, and for the first time in days, Ambrosia allowed herself to remove her helmet. Her hair was dark, cropped short for utility, and her face was smudged with soot. She looked exhausted, the lines of fatigue etched around her eyes. You should sleep, Caspian said softly. He was sitting across the small blue-flamed stove, his silver hair catching the light. I will take the first watch. I do not trust your watch, she said, but there was no heat in it. She leaned her head against the wall, her eyes fluttering shut. Why do you do it? The hair, the aesthetic. In a world like this, why bother being beautiful? The word hung in the air, a confession she had not intended to make. Caspian looked at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wanted to tell her the truth, that Fae did not choose to be beautiful. They were reflections of the world's natural grace, a grace that humanity had tried to burn away. He wanted to tell her that she was more beautiful than any sunrise he had seen in 500 years. Beauty is a form of resistance, he said instead. The ministry wants us to be gray. They want us to be shadows and dust. If you can still find something that is not broken to look at, they have not won yet. Ambrosia did not answer. Her breathing had leveled out into the heavy rhythm of sleep. Caspian sat in the silence, his gaze fixed on her face. In sleep, the hardness of the hunter vanished, leaving behind the girl she might have been if the world had not ended. He felt a surge of guilt so sharp it felt like a blade. He was leading her toward a truth that would shatter her. He was using the fated mate bond, a sacred cosmic connection, to manipulate her into being his scout. I am protecting her, he told himself. I am the only one who can keep her safe when the hunters realize what she is to me. But as he watched the way her hand curled in her sleep, reaching for a warmth that was not there, he knew he was also the man who was going to break her heart. Ambrosia. The dream started with the smell of jasmine. It was a scent she did not know, a scent that should not exist in a world of ash. She was walking through a forest, but the trees were not wood. They were made of light. The ground was soft, green, and vibrant, and there was no weight of armor on her shoulders. Then the sky turned red. The trees began to scream. They were not trees. They were people. Fae. Their iridescent eyes were melting, their skin sloughing off in the heat of a nuclear sun, and standing in the middle of the fire was her father. She had never known him. The ministry said he was a casualty of a Fae raid when she was an infant, but in the dream, he had no face. He was just a silhouette of gold and silver, his hands reaching out to her. You are a hunter of your own heart, Ambrosia, he whispered, his voice a chorus of 1,000 dying birds. She looked down at her hands and saw they were covered in blood, not human blood. It was glowing, ethereal, and it would not wash off. She tried to scream, but her throat was full of ash. Ambrosia bolted upright, a strangled cry dying in her throat. Her heart was thundering, her skin slick with a cold, greasy sweat. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The darkness of the research station felt like a tomb. Ambrosia. The voice was steady, grounding. She looked to her left and saw Casp. He had not moved from his spot by the stove, but he was watching her with an expression of such profound, quiet empathy that it hurt to look at him. I am fine, she snapped, her hands trembling as she reached for her canteen. She took a long, jagged swallow of water, her teeth clicking against the metal. Just a dream, the radiation in the spires. You said it plays tricks. That was not the spires, Casp said gently. He did not move toward her. He knew she would bolt, but he leaned forward just enough that his presence felt like a blanket. That was the truth trying to wake you up. Shut up, she whispered. She pulled her knees to her chest, her armor clanking in the silence. She felt small. She felt exposed. The bond was humming again, a low, soothing frequency that tried to pull her toward him, promising that if she just leaned her head on his shoulder, the nightmares would stop. She hated it. She hated him for being the source of it. Go to sleep, Casp, she said, her voice cracking. He did not answer. He did not argue. He just sat there, a silver-haired shadow in the dim light. Ambrosia lay back down, but she did not close her eyes. She watched the way the blue flame of the stove reflected in his gray eyes. He did not sleep. He stayed awake, a silent sentinel between her and the dark, watching the door and the shadows until the bruised ochre of the dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the walls. And for the first time in 6 years, Ambrosia Jones did not feel like she was hunting alone. Chapter 3. The trek through the spires ended where the ruins of Oakhaven began. It was a city of glass skeletons and rusted rebar, a place where the ministry map simply turned into a gray void. Patrol, Ambrosia hissed, dropping low behind a crumbled brick wall. Caspian dropped beside her instantly. A Vanguard recon unit was sweeping the intersection 3 blocks ahead. Their scanners pulsed in rhythmic blue circles, cutting through the smog. Ambrosia watched them, her hand tight on her rifle, but then she shifted her gaze to Caspian. He was moving with a fluidity that shouldn't be possible for a drifter. He didn't just crouch, he flowed into the shadows, his weight distributed so perfectly that he didn't even displace the grit beneath his boots. One of the hunters stopped, his visor swiveling toward their position. He lingered, sensing a disturbance in the air, the way a predator recognizes a shape that doesn't belong to the terrain. "He sees you," she whispered, her heart hammering. "He sees a ghost," Caspian replied, his voice barely a vibration. They waited until the patrol passed, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Ambrosia knew then, the way he moved, the way the air seemed to bend around him. He was Fae, but the question that burned in her gut was why a High King was guiding a hunter to his own people. They spent the next 2 days navigating the guts of the dead city, forced into narrow alleys and shared crawl spaces. The proximity was a slow torture. Every time his shoulder brushed hers, the bond flared, a white-hot spark in her marrow. "You're going to tell me," she said on the second night, her voice echoing in the hollowed-out lobby of a former bank, "why a consultant knows so much about the High King's trail." Caspian looked at the small fire, his gray eyes reflecting the flickering blue light. "I have the memory of 5 centuries, Ambrosia. I remember when this city was green. I remember the arrival." He began to speak, not with the rehearsed cadence of a lecturer, but with the weary weight of a witness. He told her about the Fae crossing over from a dying realm, pleading for refuge. He spoke of a negotiated peace, of decades where Fae magic and human technology hummed in a fragile, beautiful harmony. "Then came the erosion," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "The fear cycles, scapegoating. People forgot that the Fae were guests and started seeing them as invaders." "The burn happened because the Fae attacked the power grids," Ambrosia countered, the ministry's doctrine sliding off her tongue like a reflex. "They tried to plunge us into the dark." Caspian looked up, the glamour over his eyes flickering for a split second. "I was there, Ambrosia. I watched radical human cells plant the devices in the Fae districts. They didn't want peace. They wanted a reason for a purge. The founders of your ministry, men like General Vance and Director Call, were not heroes. They were architects of a massacre." "That's propaganda," she snapped, standing up. "Sophisticated disinformation designed to break a hunter's resolve. I've been briefed on these tactics." But even as she said it, her mind betrayed her. She remembered the redacted reports in the Citadel archives. She remembered the anomalous readings in her own blood work that her mentors dismissed as environmental stress. The cracks were there, jagged and deep. Caspian wasn't making them. He was just holding the torch. The air in the lobby grew thick, charged with a sudden suffocating electricity. The tension that had been building since the cathedral finally snapped. Ambrosia crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, her hands gripping the lapels of his duster. She didn't think. She reacted to the gravity pulling her into his orbit. She kissed him first, a desperate, bruising collision of teeth and heat. It was a release of years of repressed hunger, a silent scream against the lies she had lived. For a heartbeat, Caspian leaned into her, his hands finding the curve of her waist, his magic surging against her skin. Then, with a groan that sounded like a physical wound, he pulled back. He caught her wrists, holding her at arm's length, his breathing ragged. "I cannot," he rasped. "Not like this." "Why?" she demanded, her face flushed, her eyes searching his. "Because I will not take a single breath from you under a false pretense," he said. He looked at her then, the glamour dropping entirely. His eyes were pure, swirling gold. "The ministry didn't bind you, Ambrosia. They built you." He told her about the breeding programs. He didn't use soft words. He spoke of Fae women held in the bowels of the Citadel, of the extraction of essence, and the forced hybridization that created the vanguard hunters. "You aren't a weapon they wield against the dark," Caspian whispered, the truth hanging in the air like a death sentence. "You are the stolen blood of my people. You are Fae, Ambrosia, half-born, designed to hunt your own kin so the ministry could keep its hands clean." The silence that followed was absolute. The fire hissed, a final blue spark dying in the ash. Ambrosia didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply let go of his jacket and backed away, her boots clicking on the marble floor. Every wall of her reality had just crumbled, leaving her standing in the ruins of her own identity. "Ambrosia," he started, reaching out a hand. "Don't," she said. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. She turned and walked out of the lobby, disappearing into the jagged shadows of the dead city. Caspian stood by the dying fire and let her go, knowing that some truths are too heavy to carry in the light of another. Chapter 4. The ruins of Oakhaven were not silent. They were filled with the skeletal groans of leaning skyscrapers and the dry, rhythmic hiss of ash against glass. Ambrosia moved through the debris like a ghost haunting her own life. Her mind was a cold, clinical machine, processing the wreckage of the identity she had worn for 24 years. She found a secluded basement in what remained of an old pharmacy. The air was stale, smelling of ancient dust and forgotten chemicals. It was perfect. She sat on the floor, her movements precise and mechanical. She pulled the field medical kit from her tactical vest and laid it out on a cracked tile floor. She was not a woman who collapsed. Collapse was for those who had something to lose. Ambrosia Jones, or whoever the hell she was, had only ever had the mission, and the mission required data. She pricked her finger with the lancet. The drop of blood that welled up was dark, almost crimson, but when the LED light of the scanner hit it, there was a faint, iridescent shimmer, an oily, violet sheen that should not exist in human biology. She ran the sequence. Species, human. Anomalous markers present 34%. Genetic origin, unclassified/redacted. She read the results once, then she recalibrated the sensor and read them again. On the third pass, she bypassed the ministry's software locks, a trick she had learned from a tech runner in the dead zones 3 years ago. The screen flickered. The unclassified label dissolved. Genotype, Fae hybrid, Class A. Lineage, High Court, Royal Bloodline, match 98%. The device slipped from her hand, clattering against the floor. She leaned her head against the cold concrete wall and closed her eyes. Memory was a treacherous thing. It rewrote itself in the face of truth. She thought of Commander Vane, the man who had raised her in the barracks. He had called her the organization's best investment during her graduation ceremony. She had thought it was a compliment to her skill. Now she realized he was talking about her yield. She was a crop, a biological asset designed to track and kill her own ancestors because her heart beat with the same frequency as theirs. Every time a hunter had looked at her with that strange, lingering pity, every routine hormone treatment that left her feeling like her skin was too tight for her soul, every report she had filed on Fae sightings that was quietly shelved by the ministry's higher-ups. She was not a hero. She was a bloodhound, wearing the collar of the people who had murdered her mother. Ambrosia stood up. The controlled demolition of her world was complete. All that was left was the ash. She found Caspian exactly where she had left him. He had not moved. He sat by the dying embers of the blue-flamed stove, his silver hair a beacon in the gloom of the bank lobby. He looked up as she stepped through the shattered entrance, his expression unreadable, though his gold eyes burned with a fierce, tethered light. "I ran my blood," she said, her voice flat. And you are a liar," she said, walking toward him until she was standing directly over him. "But you are not wrong." She sat down opposite him, not with the caution of a hunter, but with the heavy, exhausted weight of a survivor. "Tell me everything. No more masks, no more Casp. Who are you and why are you here?" Caspian took a slow, deep breath. The air around him seemed to shimmer as he released the last of his glamour. He grew taller, his features sharpening into a beauty so severe it was almost violent. The weathered duster stayed, but the aura he projected was that of a man who had commanded armies across centuries. "I am Caspian, of the House of Winter, King of the Unseen," he said, "and I have been navigating this bond in bad faith since the moment I saw you in the cathedral." He did not make himself the hero. He told her about the Fae court's cowardice, how they had retreated into the deeper folds of the world and left the hybrids and the weaker kin to be harvested by the ministry. He told her about the compromises he had made to keep his people hidden, even if it meant letting the breeding programs continue in the shadows because he was too afraid of another burn to declare open war. "The bond," she whispered, her throat tight. "What is it?" "A fated mate resonance," he said, his voice raw. "It is a cosmic anchor. When I saw you, I felt my soul snap into alignment with yours. It did not matter that you were wearing the ministry's steel. It did not matter that you were hunting me. I knew, and I used that knowledge. I played on your confusion, on your physical reaction to me, to ensure you would lead me to the facility. You manipulated me," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You knew I was falling apart, and you used the gravity between us to steer me." "Yes," he said simply. "I am a king, Ambrosia. My people are being drained of their life to power human cities. I would have used anyone to find the source, but I did not expect you to be you." They sat in silence for a long time. The honesty was a jagged thing, cutting them both. "I do not forgive you," Ambrosia said as the first bruised light of dawn touched the glass shards on the floor. "The deception, the bad faith, that stays. But I am not going back to the Citadel. I am going to burn that facility to the ground, for my mother, for the girl they stole. And if you want to save your people, you are the only asset I have left." "I am not an asset," he murmured, standing up. "And you are not my scout." "Then what are we?" He moved toward her, and this time there was no hesitation. The bond was no longer a hum, it was a roar. The proximity was a physical ache, a demand for contact that had been building since they first met in the ruins of the cathedral. "We are inevitable," he said. He reached out, his fingers ghosting over the skin of her neck, right where the brand of his magic had first touched her. The heat was instantaneous. Ambrosia gasped, her hands flying to his chest, bunching the fabric of his duster. She did not push him away. She pulled him closer. The kiss was different this time. It was not a collision. It was a homecoming. It tasted of ash and ancient magic, of the desperation of two people who had nothing left but each other. Caspian's hands were in her hair, his touch possessing and reverent at once. She needed this. She needed to feel something that was not a ministry directive or a cold tactical assessment. She needed the fire. They moved together with a frantic, starving energy. Ambrosia stripped away the layers of her tactical gear, the armor that had felt like a second skin, but now felt like a cage. When her skin finally met his, the resonance was so powerful, it felt like a physical shock. Her Fae blood sang in response to his, a harmony that drowned out the world. He laid her back on the tattered remains of a velvet sofa in the corner of the lobby. The blue flames of the stove cast long dancing shadows against the marble. Caspian's touch was a mapping of her soul. He kissed the scars on her shoulders, the marks of her training, the places where the ministry had tried to turn her into a machine. He worshipped the parts of her she had been taught to hate. "You are beautiful," he whispered against her skin, his voice thick with a 500-year-old hunger. "Not because of what they made you, because of what they could not kill." When he entered her, the bond finally snapped into full agonizing focus. It was not just physical, it was a flood of emotion and memory. She felt his grief for a lost world, his heavy crown, his absolute, terrifying devotion to her. And he felt her, the loneliness of the barracks, the cold steel of the rifle, and the sudden, blinding light of a truth she was finally brave enough to hold. The act was a rebellion. It was a declaration of ownership over their own bodies, their own fates. In the ruins of a city built on lies, they found the only truth that mattered. They moved in a rhythm that was ancient, a dance of winter storm and liquid fire, until the world outside the bank lobby ceased to exist. As the climax took them, Ambrosia did not see the ash. She saw the forest of light from her dreams. She saw the jasmine, and she knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that she was not hunting alone anymore. The sun rose over Oakhaven, a pale, sickly yellow through the smog. Ambrosia lay with her head on Caspian's chest, the rhythm of his heart a steady drum beneath her ear. Her armor lay in a heap on the floor, a discarded shell. "We leave for the facility at noon," she said, her voice steady. Caspian ran a hand down the length of her back, his touch lingering on the base of her spine. They will be waiting. They know you have not checked in. Let them wait, she said, looking up at him. Her eyes were no longer just the cold gray of a hunter. There was a spark of gold in the center, a flicker of the fire that was just beginning to burn. They think they created a weapon. They have no idea what happens when that weapon decides to aim itself. Caspian leaned down, pressing a final lingering kiss to her brow. Then we give them a war they will never forget, my queen. Ambrosia did not correct him. She just stood up, reached for her knife, and began to prepare for the end of the world. Chapter 5. The Glass Altar. The facility was not a dungeon. It was something far more efficient, and therefore far more terrifying. Located beneath the salt flats of the Northern Reach, the Sector 7 Life Sciences Complex appeared from the surface as a cluster of weathered ventilation stacks and a single unassuming landing pad. Beneath the crust, however, it was a sprawling hive of brushed steel, pressurized seals, and fluorescent lights that never flickered. It was an obscenity dressed in the language of progress. Ambrosia stood at the edge of the perimeter, her binoculars tracking the sweep of the automated sentry towers. "Shift change. In 3 minutes," she whispered. Her voice was steady, but her pulse was a frantic drum against her ribs. The thermal sensors in the west quadrant have a 4-second lag when the backup generators cycle. That is our window. Caspian stood behind her, a shadow in the pale moonlight. He was no longer the drifter. He was the king of winter, and the air around him had grown so cold it crystallized the moisture in the air. "I can suppress the acoustic signatures," he said. "But the moment we breach the internal seals, the Ministry will know their weapon has come home." "Let them know," Ambrosia said, adjusting the seal on her tactical glove. "I am not their weapon anymore." Caspian, POV. The infiltration was a dance of two worlds. Ambrosia led the way with a lethal mechanical precision that made his heart ache. She knew every keypad bypass, every ventilation bypass, and every vocal cadence required to fool the internal comms. She was a ghost in the machine, moving through the halls of her creators with a hatred so cold it was indistinguishable from professional detachment. When they reached the first pressurized gate, a squad of 3 Vanguard juniors rounded the corner. They were young, boys really, wearing the same standard-issue gray armor Ambrosia had discarded in Oakhaven. She did not hesitate. Before they could even raise their rifles, she was among them. It was not a fight. It was an extraction. She moved with a speed that was purely Fae, a blur of motion that left all 3 unconscious on the floor before they could trip their panic alarms. "I did not kill them," she muttered, her eyes fixed on the door. "They are just children following the wrong gods." Caspian placed a hand on the console. He did not use a bypass. He used the fundamental laws of the world. He reached into the molecular structure of the lock and commanded the metal to forget its shape. The heavy steel groaned and then simply turned to fine gray sand. They stepped inside. The smell hit him first, an antiseptic tang overlaid with the sweet, cloying scent of jasmine and crushed ozone. It was the smell of stolen magic. The room was a cathedral of glass tubes. Each one contained a figure, suspended in a glowing violet fluid. They were wired into machines that hummed with a low-frequency vibration, drawing out the iridescent essence that kept the Ministry's cities powered and its hunters augmented. Caspian felt a roar building in his chest. He saw his people, warriors of the High Court, elders who had survived the burn, and most gut-wrenching of all, children. "Look at the files, Caspian," Ambrosia whispered. Her face was ashen. She was standing at a terminal, her fingers flying across the keys. She opened a directory titled Project Inheritance. There, in high-definition clarity, were the records of the breeding cycles. Caspian saw the names of the donors, Fae women who had been kept in a vegetative state for decades, and then he saw the yield. Ambrosia stopped. Her breath hitched. On the screen was a photo of a woman with the same dark cropped hair and the same piercing gray eyes. Subject 42, Ambrosia Jones, deceased. Below it, the result of her final cycle. Subject 42-B, Ambrosia. "My supervisor," Ambrosia said, her voice trembling. "Commander Vane. He was not just my mentor. He was the one who signed the requisition order for my mother's termination once my viability was confirmed. The realization did not break her. It forged her. She turned away from the screen, her eyes now burning with a gold light that threatened to overwhelm the gray. She looked at the rows of glass tubes, at the sleeping Fae, and then at the door at the far end of the hall. "We are not just getting them out," she said. "We are ending this." Ambrosia P. Ophi. The liberation was not a heist. It was a reckoning. As the alarms finally began to wail, a shrill, piercing sound that felt like it was slicing through her brain, Ambrosia moved to the main control hub. She didn't bother with the passwords. She used her rifle, shattering the casing and ripping the wires out with her bare hands. "Caspian, the seals, release the fluid." Caspian stood in the center of the room, his arms outstretched. He was no longer holding back. The floor began to frost over, the cold spreading outward in a violent wave. The glass tubes began to crack, not from pressure, but from the sheer weight of his authority. "Wake," he commanded, his voice a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the complex. The tubes shattered. Fae spilled onto the floor, gasping and shivering. Ambrosia moved among them, her training taking over. She didn't see them as enemies or resources. She saw them as her blood. She draped her own tactical jacket over a small girl who was trembling violently, her iridescent eyes wide with terror. "Stay behind me," Ambrosia told her. "I am a hunter, and nothing is going to touch you." Then the heavy blast doors at the end of the hall buckled. Commander Vane stepped through, flanked by a full company of Vanguard elite. He looked exactly as he had at her graduation, composed, fatherly, and utterly devoid of a soul. "Ambrosia," he said, his voice echoing through the chaos, "you were our greatest achievement. To see you throw it all away for a dying race, it is a profound disappointment." "I am not an achievement, Vane," she said, raising her rifle. "I am the consequence." The battle was a blurred montage of violence and magic. Vane's elite units were fast, but they were fighting a king and a woman who had been designed to be better than them. Ambrosia fought with a ferocity that bordered on the divine. She used every trick the ministry had taught her, turning their own tactics against them. She moved through the crossfire like a shadow, her blades finding the gaps in the Vanguard armor with unerring accuracy. Beside her, Caspian was a force of nature. He didn't use weapons, he used the air itself. Shards of ice as sharp as diamonds flew through the air, pinning hunters to the walls. The temperature in the room plummeted until the hunters' own breath froze in their lungs. But there were too many of them. "Get them to the lift," Caspian shouted, his face tight with strain as he held back a wall of fire from the ministry's heavy ordnance units. Ambrosia grabbed the small girl and a group of elders, ushering them toward the cargo elevator. "Go, Caspian, move." As they reached the lift, Vane fired. The high-yield pulse hit Ambrosia in the shoulder, throwing her back against the elevator doors. The pain was white-hot, a familiar agony that tasted of the ministry's brand. Caspian roared, a sound of such pure, unadulterated rage that the very ceiling began to crack. He surged forward, his hand closing around Vane's throat. "Ah, you stole her mother," Caspian hissed, his eyes glowing like twin suns. "You will not touch her." He didn't kill him with ice. He killed him with the weight of 500 years of silence. He let the cold of the void flow into Vane's body until the man simply shattered into 1,000 pieces of frozen meat. Caspian turned and leaped into the closing elevator, just as the complex's self-destruct sequence, triggered by the breach of the breeding files, began to count down, the aftermath. The explosion was a dull thud beneath the salt flats, sending a plume of white dust into the early morning sky. They sat a mile away, huddled in the lee of a rocky outcropping. The group of liberated Fae, nearly 50 of them, were quiet, their iridescent skin drinking in the first real sunlight they had seen in generations. Ambrosia sat apart from them, her shoulder bandaged with a strip of Caspian's duster. She felt hollow. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the crushing weight of everything she had learned. Caspian approached her slowly. He sat down beside her, his presence a localized warmth that she finally allowed herself to lean into. "They are safe," he said softly. "My scouts have found us. We are moving them to the hidden fold tonight." Ambrosia looked at her hands. They were covered in soot and the blood of the men she had once called brothers. "The ministry won't stop. They know my face. They know I'm a Class A now. They'll hunt me to the ends of the earth." "Let them," Caspian said. He reached out, taking her hand in his. The bond was a steady, grounding thrum between them. "They are hunting a queen now, and she has a king at her side." Ambrosia looked toward the horizon, where the smog of the ministry's cities met the clean, cold blue of the waste. She was neither fully Fae nor fully human. She was a bridge built of bone and ash, a weapon that had learned to love. She was exactly what the world needed to burn the old gods down. "What now?" she asked. Caspian stood up, pulling her to her feet. He looked at her with an expression of such profound, chosen devotion that it made the jasmine scent in the air return, stronger than before. "Now," he said, "we go to war." The ending was not safe. It was not a resolution. It was a choice, a declaration that in a world of gray and brown, they would be the fire that brought the color back. Ambrosia Jones picked up her rifle, looked at the man who held her heart, and for the first time in her life, she didn't just have a mission. She had a future.